In today's video, we are taking a look at a wild hand from 50, 100, no limit Texas Hold'em on CoinPoker. Two of the best players in the world are battling it out, and we get the pleasure of witnessing it today. We have riggedeck, who took second place in the Cash Game World Championship on CoinPoker just recently. He won $300,000 over the course of 70,000 hands. He's a high volume, high stakes crusher who you do not want to play against because he will take your money. He is against AbsoluteTopUp, who is an up-and-coming player who just a year ago was playing 2-5 no-limit hold'em. And recently, he's moved up to 50, 100, and he had his first $100,000 profitable month ever. Let's get right to it. We are playing 50, 100 with a $15 ante and a $200 straddle. This is a big game. They are playing about $54,000 deep, so very deep stacked. Riggedeck in the low jack seat has pocket aces. That's exactly what you want in life. He raises it up to 500. It folds around to AbsoluteTopUp on the button with ace 5 of hearts. This is a spot where some players who are not familiar with good, strong GTO cash game ranges would think, I'm probably behind, or maybe I can flop well, so I'm just going to call and try to see the flop. But it turns out you really, really, really want to be 3-betting some low ace-x suited in cash games, and ace-5 suited is the best one to go for it because it can make a straight, and, well, it's a good bluff hand. Anytime you are bluffing, playing very, very deep stacked, you really, really, really want to have an ace or a king suited hand. You're going to find compared to playing shallow stacks, these hands go way up in value because you can 3-bet them, and then if you get 4-bet, you actually can call, especially when you're in position and go to the flop. So ace-5 suited loves to 3-bet. That is exactly what AbsoluteTopUp does. He makes it 1,800. It folds back around to riggedeck. A lot of players think with pocket aces that you should slow play and keep your opponent in. The problem, though, is that they're playing incredibly deep stacked. And the main time you want to slow play with aces is when you are not deep stacked. Essentially, you want to be in a scenario where your opponent's money is easily going to get all in on the flop or maybe on the turn. And that's usually going to be the case when you're playing, 30, 40, 50 big blinds deep, such that if you do call the 3-bet, you can check the flop, your opponent's going to go all in, you can call and you're happy. When you're very deep stacked, though, you really, really, really need to 4-bet with your absolute best hands, mainly pocket aces, pocket kings, and again, some ace-x suited and maybe some king-x suited. These are excellent hands to put in the 4-bet with, which is exactly what riggedeck does. Riggedeck makes it 7,600. This may feel like a very big 4-bet. You may think, what can my opponent possibly call with in this spot? Well, in reality, if they had kings, queens, jacks, tens, ace-king, ace-queen, some ace-x suited, some suited connectors, they're going to call a lot in position. This might actually be a spot where AbsoluteTopUp is not going to 4-bet much at all, because remember how I just said riggedeck only needs to 4-bet the aces if they are deep stacked. Well, now the pots become so big to the point that AbsoluteTopUp doesn't really need to 4-bet their aces because the pot's already going to be something like $15,000, right? So riggedeck could easily bet the flop, bet the turn, jam the river. AbsoluteTopUp, if they did have aces, could call the flop, call the turn, call the river, and be happy, right? They don't need to put in a re-raise at this point. So since AbsoluteTopUp's not going to need to re-raise with their aces, they get to call pretty wide, even against a somewhat big 3-bet because they are in position and their calling range will be protected due to having aces, kings, queens, etc. in it. So if you are out of position in this spot, you want to go kind of big like riggedeck does to something like $7,600 to cut off your opponent's implied odds with their hands, like pocket pairs and suited aces and suited connectors and whatnot. So that is why riggedeck uses the big size. AbsoluteTopUp decides to make the absolute call and go to the flop. Some players may get really cautious and really passive in the spot and just fold and think, well, I'm probably behind. And yeah, you are behind, but you have to realize pot odds exist. At this point, you essentially need to put in something like $5,500 or so to try to win a total pot of 15,000. So you have to ask, am I going to realize 30-ish% equity in position with ace-5 of hearts? And the answer is yes, you probably will. Also, like I said, AbsoluteTopUp's range will be protected with aces, kings, queens, and ace-king in it a large chunk of the time. So for that reason, you get to call slightly wider because your opponent can't just automatically blast off into you and force you to fold out hands with equity like, say, AbsoluteTopUp flops middle pair and then faces aggression. It's a spot where you do want your opponent checking sometimes so you can just check and realize your equity. Anyway, AbsoluteTopUp does call. Left side to the flop. We're now playing about $46,000 deep with $15,000 in the pot. The flop comes 9, 6, 3, 2 hearts. Rig deck goes for a bet of 6,200. A relatively small bet, but you have to consider how the money is going to go in on the turn and the river. Imagine rig deck bets 6,000 now and gets called. The pot's going to go up to 27,000, right? With something like 40,000 remaining. That will then allow rig deck to bet something like 13 or 14,000 on the turn, and then shove the remaining 24,000 in on the river, essentially using geometric bet sizing. This is something you see the Game Theory Optimal solver do very often when you are betting with what should be a very polarized range. And in the spot, rig deck's range should be aces, kings, maybe some queens, maybe some ace kings, and then some ace x suited and king x suited bluffs. So this is a spot where rig deck essentially should be very polarized. Even though AbsoluteTopUp does have perhaps pocket nines in his range, he really doesn't have to worry about sixes and threes all that often. So this is a spot where rig deck's just going to go geometric right from the start. Rig deck goes 6,200. Now what I want to know is, what would you do if you were in this scenario with the ace five of hearts? Would you fold? Don't do that. Would you call? Would you raise to 14,000, or would you just rip it all in? Take a second, think about it, and let me know what you would do in the comment section down below. While you're down there, do me a favor, click the like and subscribe button for me, please. Given rig deck's range should be very polarized, either very good made hands that are never folding, aces and kings, and some bluffs like ace king, which you may be able to bluff out later, or ace x suited, which clearly doesn't have a flush draw, or maybe king x suited, which every once in a while you're going to completely crush when they have hearts. This is a spot where you definitely do not want to raise the ace five of hearts, or pretty much anything. Even though rig deck did use a somewhat small bet, this is a spot where in position you just want to call, because if you do raise and get shoved on, well, now ace five suited with a flush draw shrivels up, right? You're going to have 40-ish% equity, and you're behind. You don't want to put $46,000 in behind. You'd much prefer to put in $6,000 behind. And when you do get your opponent to fold in this spot, usually they were either drawing thin with some nonsense, or they have a hand like ace king that you'll be able to bluff out later a decent amount of the time. So this is a spot where AbsoluteTopUp should not have much of a raising range at all, which means they should call even with draws. Do not think you should automatically raise with draws every single time. That is a big mistake that will cost you a lot of money in the long run, especially when you are in position and you'll be able to realize your equity very well. The turn is the jack of spades. Rig deck goes for a half pot bet of 14,000. Some players would take the, call it, easy route out on this two flush straight draw board and just rip it all in. But you have to realize you're not actually all that worried about your opponent having a flush draw or a straight draw in this situation, because AbsoluteTopUp's not going to have a whole lot of hands like queen 10 suited, right? They can't have the ace x of spades because the ace of spades is in rig deck's hand. So the only logical draw that AbsoluteTopUp is going to have in this scenario is the ace high flush draw, which, you know, they could have, but recognize that only has 20-ish% equity in the scenario, which is not a lot. So whenever you do bet half pot in this scenario, you've to some extent cut off your opponent's immediate pot odds. And, you know, they may have a little bit of implied odds, but such is life. You're not only concerned about pricing out the draws, though. Remember, you want to make sure you keep your opponent in with hands that are drawing thin or dead. Like, say, AbsoluteTopUp does have pocket tens or pocket queens. You want to make sure they stay in the pot. What if they had random 9-8 suited? You want them to stay in the pot, right? So you need to make a bet, but you don't want to bet so large to the point that the medium strength hands you want to get value from will fold. And those medium strength value hands should actually be a large chunk of AbsoluteTopUp's range. So rig deck goes 14,000. This is an interesting spot because at this point, if AbsoluteTopUp thinks rig deck has some bluffs in his range that will fold to a shove that actually beat the ace five of hearts, perhaps like ace king, ace queen, ace 10, there certainly is merit in just ripping it all in. Because when you shove all in here and your opponent folds, you scoop a massive pot, right? Without having to actually get there. However, if you think rig deck's range is far more, call it top heavy with aces and kings, and perhaps you don't think they'll continue bluffing the turn with stuff like ace king, ace queen, ace 10, then when they're betting the turn like this, they will be quite strong on average. Now look, rig deck is one of the absolute best players in the world. I'm going to presume he's very close to balanced, or he's doing whatever the best maximally exploitative play is. So against someone you know to be very good, you want to just fall back on GTO strategies and do whatever GTO recommends. In this situation, I think the right play is, again, to just have a calling range and not much of a raising range, especially when rigged deck takes this somewhat geometric bet sizing line. And that means you're going to call with all the hands that want to continue calling. Also notice with your draws, if you did have the ace high flush draw or the king high flush draw or something like that, either spades or hearts, while you're not getting the correct immediate odds to draw against a hand like aces or kings, you are getting pretty good implied odds, right? Because you can kind of count on that other $24,000 to go into the pot on the river. So you can call here, recognizing if you get there, you're probably going to get paid. And if you don't, well, maybe you can run a bluff. So absolute top up calls. The river is the queen of clubs. And a lot of players in rigged deck shoes think they should just rip it all in because aces are probably good. And to be fair, they are probably good. However, it's important to recognize that when you shove in this scenario, what does absolute top up's range look like? Well, it's going to be a lot of pretty medium strength hands like 9-8 suited, pocket tens, that are going to probably fold out to a river shove, or busted draws that are always going to fold to a river shove. And you may say, but don't we want to bet because the medium strength hands are going to check behind a lot? Well, that is a reason to bet. The thing is, those are probably going to fold to a shove, and also you need to consider the busted draws. And if absolute top up does have any sort of busted draw, ace high flush draws, king high flush draws, etc., if you check, they're going to feel pretty inclined to bluff, because if you consider absolute top-up's range, it's kind of hard to find bluffs. While absolute top-up certainly could have value bets with pocket queens, pocket jacks, and pocket nines, as well as perhaps aces and kings if he has them. So this is a spot where I think the right play is to check to give the bluffs every possible opportunity to go all in. Now, the problem with this may be that absolute top-up doesn't have all that many bluffs, because maybe he doesn't put in the 3-bet and call the 4-bet with king X suited. Maybe he doesn't float the flop with backdoor flush draws. Who knows, right? That said, you have to realize you're looking at the play of two world-class players. They're all going to play good and reasonably, and they're going to have potential bluffs going to the river. They're not just going to only have the nuts like a lot of your weak, tight, straightforward players will do at 1-2 no limit hold'em at your local casino. So this is a spot where rigged deck goes for the check, and I like it. Now, let's see if absolute top up tries to bluff it. Given absolute top up has almost no bluffs in his range, I think all in is the only play that makes sense. This is also a spot where if rigged deck did have a hand like ace king or ace 10, you obviously want to go all in and try to make them fold that. Again, though, the question may become, does rigged deck actually have ace 10 and ace king to 4-bet preflop, bet the flop, and then bet the turn, and then check the river looking to fold? He probably has some of those. So if that's the case, I definitely think the all-in has a lot of merit. And it has even more merit if rigged deck will not check the river with hands like aces, kings, queens, jacks, and nines. Probably doesn't have a whole lot of nines, and maybe not even jacks, but if rigged deck will always bet the river with aces and kings and queens, well, then his range gets far weaker, and then the bluff becomes absolutely mandatory. And if you are playing against small stakes opponents, I think that is very often going to be the case. Most players bet their good hands on the river, and they don't check them because they're scared of not getting value. That's not the case against the best players in the world, though. As we can see here, they will protect their checking ranges, which is something I always recommend you all do. If you've studied at PokerCoaching.com or at PeakGTO.com, you know I'm always saying it like a broken record. Make sure you protect your checking ranges, because if you check and then fold too often to a bet, you're going to get ran over. Absolute top up tries to run rigged deck over. He rips it all in. After a bit of thought, rigged deck makes the call, which to some people may seem obvious. You have the aces, like, check, call, ship the money, $108,000 going rigged deck's direction. But it's actually closer than it may look, because like I said, it's kind of hard for absolute top up to have bluffs, and absolute top up definitely has a lot of combinations of queens, jacks, and nines. That said, pot odds exist. Absolute top up is a world-class player who's obviously not afraid to bluff. If that's the case, find the call, hope you win, and sometimes you will and sometimes you won't. This time, though, the gigantic pot gets pushed rigged deck's direction. That's it for today. If you enjoyed today's video, do me a favor, click the like and subscribe button down below. Make sure you check out the links in the description. We have a lot of great stuff down there for you. Good luck in your games. Have fun. And if you decide to bluff it off in a gigantic pot with the ace high, I hope your opponents make a nitty fold.